Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for a brand new Film Fanatic show. It is 10/19 May 18th. It's Monday. Hope everyone's had a good weekend. Had a really fun weekend. Had some really nice rehearsals. Had a big rehearsal yesterday. Had a really fun show at Opera House Video on Saturday. And then I also went to see the new Curry Barker film Obsession, which I had been wanting to see for an insane amount of time. Just uploaded the my video, my review of that film. Pretty tremendous movie. I was in it. I was in it to win it. And check it out. Check out the review. I definitely can't stress enough that if you get a chance to definitely get to go, go to see Obsession in the theater. It's meant for that. You know, it's meant for the theater experience. Pretty tremendous horror film. So yeah, super excited. You know, I was a little bit cautious. A little nervous, I guess, to a degree because when you hear about a movie, and sometimes when it's well, in this case, it's a long time, almost a year, maybe even more actually. When I think of it, and you hear a lot of good things, and then it just keeps building, and then it gets to become this kind of big hype. There's a lot of hype around the film. So, and it was mostly really positive. So, you kind of always have to like take it for what it is, take it in stride, because you can be. I've had that experience, and again, I can leave that stuff behind, but it can kind of just leave the whole thing to be. It can be really, just kind of a little bit much. There's like a wave around a film, and you can't make up your mind, until you actually see and experience the film for what it is, and by that kind of standard of just having that experience. That's really all that you can measure it on or by. So, but it was all that being said, it was a pretty fantastic experience, and I really really want to see it again. So we'll see. It's playing. It's not playing anywhere locally. It's playing like in. I know it's playing. I think it's playing in Brunswick and Portland, and then it's playing where I saw it in Bangor for probably another week or two. And it made a shit ton of money for it being such a low budget movie, which is pretty inspiring. So yeah, get a chance if you get a chance to check it out. It was pretty fantastic. So this video show today is kind of an upgrade of sorts. Meaning, this is kind of a video on a movie that I have always liked, and I always thought it was, well, I should say, I always kind of thought it was pretty decent. And it's really grown on me. And then, kind of on a whim, I watched it. I actually rented it at World Famous Opera House Video probably about 2 weeks ago or so. And I was really, really into this movie. And I really think that this movie is one of the most kind of underrated films of one of the greatest directors. And that is Vampires from the one and only John Carpenter. I just bought this last week on Blu-ray, and I really love this movie. I think it's really great. I think it's one of John Carpenter's films that doesn't get enough credit. John Carpenter, of course, legend. I went to Bull Moose on Wednesday of last week, and I did a show on it, and I actually picked up two John Carpenter titles. One especially was probably one of my most sought out movies to buy on Blu-ray, and that is John Carpenter's 1982's The Thing, which I think is probably the best movie he's ever directed. And John Carpenter is one of my favorite directors of all time. I think I think it's really safe to say that The Thing is probably his best movie he's ever directed. And I've kind of arrived to the conclusion that, if somebody was to ask me, what do you think is the best horror movie ever made? I actually had somebody ask me that last year. And, that's a pretty, pretty intense question. Because again, there's like Jesus, there's so many an endless amount of movies to pick from and to think about. I don't usually do. That's one of the reasons that it's really hard for me to do, a top 20 or even a top 10 list on my favorite movies of all time. I can do that, and I have done some shows on things like that or things related to that. And I can do, I can definitely come up with a list of some of my favorite things relatively easy. But once it gets past, naming say 5 movies or 10 movies, it's really hard because to me it's like it's always it's always changing or to a degree. Certain movies get bumped up to the list, and I'm always discovering new movies, and so it's always I don't know. I guess the problem is I just love too many movies too much. So they're all really great, and so it's always that thing. But I remember somebody had asked me that randomly last year. I was out somewhere. I might have been at to see a music event, and somehow we were, surprise, surprise, talking about movies, and somebody had asked me, "What do you think is your favorite film?" And I had named the Lucio Fulci's the From Beyond or The Gates of Hell as being my favorite film, which still is a fucking masterpiece. Lucio Fulci is my favorite horror director, but I don't know, and The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing has always been. I've always thought it's always one of the greatest, if not the greatest horror movies ever made. But I picked it up finally on Blu-ray because I've been seeking it out, and surprisingly, I just found it pretty hard finding a really great definitive copy of that movie on Blu-ray. I was so psyched to finally get it, and I have to say, after buying it and watching it, it's got to be. I feel pretty comfortable saying that I think it's the greatest horror movie ever made. So there I said it, and you can quote me on that for what it's worth. But getting back to the main topic at hand, which is John Carpenter's Vampires, this movie, I guess you could say, I mean, with movies in general, I always have some kind of long history tied to them. Franchises, independent films, or standalone films. It's always kind of a thing. This was one of kind of the later films of John Carpenter's career. He made, I think, after this film, he only made a few more films. There was one other movie that he made called The Ghosts of Mars, and then there was another one which I can't remember the title, which came out later. Sometime it came out maybe like 10 years ago, and it's a I don't know anybody knows the name of it. Help me out if you want. But there was a later film that he did. I think it was his last film that he did. It was in the 2000s, where it was essentially kind of a ghost story, but it took place in an insane asylum. And then the movie he did before that was Ghosts of Mars, I believe, and then Vampires. So Vampire, and John Carpenter's pretty much as a filmmaker, and again, one of my favorite directors of all time, one of the most important directors of all time, one of the most influential directors of all time, especially when it comes to horror. I mean, the horror genre that we all know and love would not be what it is if it wasn't for the amazing John Carpenter. And so he's kind of more or less, and it's been quite a few years. He's pretty much retired as a director, but he's still incredibly active, mostly in the music world. He has been doing a lot of soundtrack work over the last 5 to 10 years. He's always been somebody who, well, obviously composes a lot of the music for his own film, including Vampires, which is really good, and it's a very different kind of a sound. Um, but in the last 5 to 10 years, he's kind of retired from actually directing films, and he's kind of moved into just becoming a full time, more or less a musician, and also collecting some big checks from Bloomhouse over the Friday, the rebooting or reimagining, if you want to call it that, of the last David Allen Green Halloween film. So he's made, I mean, I guess as a director, as a iconic figure in the world of horror, he's probably made more money in the last 5 years than he's ever, or 10 years or so, than he's ever made in his career, just so off of that franchise alone. Like, it's insane. But lately, what he's been doing is he's been doing a lot of film score stuff with his son. I think his name is Cody, and he's been doing all kinds of film score stuff. They started a partnership, and they've been touring. He's been touring a lot. He's been touring a lot, actually, where, and there's some really great videos of John Carpenter's band, essentially, with his son, and I think his godson is in the band also. He's basically been on the road touring, performing all of the music from all of his films, and it's actually really cool. I've checked out some of the videos and some of the footage, and there's some killer stuff on there. Really, really cool. So, even though John Carpenter is more or less retired from filmmaking, he is, he's incredibly prolific. He's still, just up until, I think he did a big tour, performing his own music, just like up until like the fall or so of last year. So, and he's been doing that a lot. And then also a ton of movies, different, various horror films have been coming out. He's been just scoring them, doing the soundtrack. So it's pretty awesome. I mean, so he's like really, really active. He's in good health and really prolific. So he hasn't gone too far. And he, makes, John Carpenter's been doing a lot of, the last 5 to 10 years. Like, he goes to all these big conventions, and so, he's really still in the public and really active and doing all kinds of work. So, but I consider the movie, today's movie, Vampires, to be definitely one of his later films, kind of, more or less at the tail end of his career. And Vampires came out in '98. So, I mean, quite a few years old by today's standards, but still, definitely, when you think of his career, you know, starting in the '70s with Assault on Precincts 13 into Halloween, pretty insanely long and prolific career for, virtually, for, almost just shy of maybe, you know, 2 decades. So, and Vampires is one of those movies that I remember. I've seen Vampires quite a few times. And I remember when this movie came out in the '90s, and I honestly wasn't a real. Well, even to this day, I'm not really a big fan, and I don't want to make a general statement, but I think for the most part, for me, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of horror films that came out in the '90s, especially when it comes to slasher movies. And so, and the reason is because I don't really like kind of the tone of a lot of the later day or '90s slasher movies that came out. I don't really like a lot of horror films that came out, mainly because, or even science fiction or fantasy, because it was kind of the beginning of CGI, and CGI was still at its infant stage, and it was a new thing. So, and I think because it was a new thing and it was a cheaper way to go for a lot of filmmakers, which I can understand, it was used in this, extreme way. It was used in so many films. And I just feel like I'm not a very big fan of CGI, but I think especially during that time period when I find for myself when I watch a movie from the 90s, and this came out in the late 90s, but still it was a thing. It just looks really bad. It looks really artificial to me, and I'm not, and it just it, yeah, because through and through I'm a practical effects guy, and I just like beg and crave to see practical effects, even to this day. And it's kind of going, I think it's kind of going. A lot of when great things are achieved, music or film, a certain style, if you will, or a certain kind of a aesthetic, it always kind of comes back around because people realize, well, okay, that's where the good shit's at, or that's where it started. So it kind of always has this thing of kind of coming back. It never goes away completely, and it's kind of been coming back. I think lately where there's been a pretty good combination of practical effects. Practical effects have definitely been coming back in new horror films, and also to a degree, not always the case, but with some CGI technology, how that's grown, that in some ways has grown, does look better and does hold up a lot better. But and the other thing with more so with slasher movies is the thing that I love about slasher movies and why I love horror films, especially horror exploitation movies from the uh, 60s, 70s, and 80s, is because I feel like, you know, well, it's the practical effects, but the rawness, the raw quality of a lot of the films, even down to where a lot of the times where, say, the final girl or the cast of say a slasher film, there's a, you know, people seem to be more realistic, whereas like I felt like in the 90s, a lot of newer slasher films and horror films got really glossy and they looked really. Everybody in the cast for a particular film or so would. They just looked too pretty. They looked too nice. And I felt like they don't look like real people anymore. There's like. Everything is too glossy, too slick, and I miss that rawness. And for me, that's a thing that gives me some problems with movies in the 90s. And again, that's not a total, blanket generalization because I do feel like there have been, there are some movies in the 90s that I do like that still look really good and that have a real big watchability to them and all those things. But it's in the minority, to be honest, for me personally. And I kind of feel like I remember when John Carpenter put out Vampires, and it's really, on paper, it's kind of a win-win situation. When, again, growing up being a massive, massive John Carpenter fan, and the idea of him doing a vampire movie is just like, wow, one of the masters of horror making a vampire movie. I mean, it's like, how can that go wrong? And I remember seeing Vampires like when it came out, I think on DVD, and I remember like thinking that this movie was okay. I don't know, like I thought it was okay. It was decent, but it was never for me. It was never on par with his classic films. The obvious and obvious the obvious ones. But I just always thought it was okay. I always thought it was decent, and it kind of served its purpose. It was watchable, but I never really liked it. I never really was, I guess, a massive fan. Compared to say his other films. And so I had seen it. I had seen Vampires a couple times on DVD throughout the years. Actually, seen it quite a few times. When I think about it. And so I saw it probably a handful of times when it came out. I didn't see it in the theater. I saw it like on DVD because this was the late 90s. So DVD, the DVD explosion was, well, well a thing, well on its way. It was, DVDs kind of came out in the early 90s. This came out in 98, so it was like kind of at the height. And I remember, renting it, seeing it a couple times when it came out in that time, and thought it was okay. I always thought it was, decent. Not great, but I always thought it was pretty good. There were things about it I liked. And so, and then there was a whole bunch of time went by where I don't know, kind of forgot about this movie. Kind of forgot about it. And then there were a few times over, say, the last, 10 years or so, where I would watch or see this movie. I saw it a couple times and I kind of felt like, yeah, it's good. It kind of grew on me a little bit more. I kind of found myself enjoying it a little bit more. And then again, there was this long period of time where I didn't see it for a very long time. Probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. So, and then just randomly, I guess a couple weeks ago, totally randomly, or it's actually more than a couple weeks ago, it was a few weeks ago. I had run, I had gone to Opera House Video, and I was gonna go. I kind of wanted to revisit some movies, and then they had gotten in. One of the reasons I went there was that Opera House Video had just gotten in a copy of The Curse of Michael Myers, so I wanted to kind of go and revisit a lot of the older or later, I should say, later Halloween films, which I've always felt the same kind of thing. Entertaining, they're fun, but I never really liked them. I never really like fully embraced them. So I kind of wanted to revisit those movies. And then when I was there, I was like, wow, okay, Vampires is here. I haven't seen it in a long time. I'm going to give this another chance. So I rented it along with the other Halloween movies and I watched Vampires and it was on DVD. And this was like a few weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. And I was like, this movie's fucking awesome. And that was my first reaction. I totally found myself totally into this movie. And then afterwards, I was kind of like, what the fuck's wrong with me? This movie's been out since '98. I've seen it, you know, I guess probably up until a few weeks ago. I'd probably seen, when I think back, I probably seen Vampires maybe 6 times or so, and I never really like embraced this movie. But then for whatever reason, watched it again, and it wasn't any different as far as like it wasn't. I had never seen this movie, didn't see it in the theater when it came out. This wasn't a Blu-ray or 4K version. It was like a standard DVD, pretty decent quality, not great, but pretty decent quality. But for some reason, I totally connected with this movie, and I was like, this movie is awesome. And it totally is one of those things that just clicked. So last week I was at Bull Moose, and Vampires was one of the first movies that I saw up there, and it was pretty cheap and has a lot of special features on here. I had never seen any documentaries on vampires. I'd never seen any interviews with John Carpenter talking about this movie, and I instantly bought it, and I watched it a couple of nights ago, and this movie's fucking awesome. This is like gone straight to kind of the top of the list as far as one of my favorite John Carpenter movies. And I'm like, man, what the hell? I was so surprised and taken aback. And then I remember I went to the movies last weekend or the weekend before with a buddy, and we had gone to see the the new Mortal Kombat film, which was really good, Mortal Kombat 2, which was a really big surprise. I really enjoyed that movie. And we were hanging out a little bit after the movie because we went to the matinee. And I was talking to my buddy about this movie, and I hadn't yet gotten it on Blu-ray. It was before. It was like the weekend before I'd gone up to Bangor to the Bangor Bull Moose, and we were talking about movies afterwards and talking about how much we kind of really enjoyed and was really surprised by Mortal Kombat. And I started talking about some other movies I had seen that weekend or that week, and then he was talking about the same thing. And then we started talking about vampires, and I'm like, you know what? Why aren't more people talking about this movie? And for me, I'm like, why didn't I appreciate this movie more when it came out? And I'm like, because I think Vampires is kind of a fucking awesome movie, and it really is. It's really great. I think it's one of the most kind of underrated films that John Carpenter's ever directed. There were the special features on here are really great. There's all kinds of great interviews. This was also put out by Shout Factory, who also had put out the beautiful edition that I got finally of The Thing. So when I watched this, and the transfer of this on Blu-ray is absolutely fucking spectacular. It blows the DVD version out of the water. It's all remastered, restored. The picture quality is amazing. The sound quality is amazing. And I was like, man, this movie totally rocks. And I was like, this movie has got to be one of the most underrated films of John Carpenter's incredible career. I think it's awesome. I think it's a great vampire movie. James Woods is in it. I mean, it's got just a killer cast. I also didn't realize that John Carpenter did all the music for this film, and it's really great. And the thing that I love about this movie is the it feels like a western. It's like a western vampire movie, and I'm a huge, massive fan of John Ford films. In the old school American Western aesthetic. I love those films. And John Carpenter for years has talked about, you know, growing up, getting turned on to film, and then also, really talking about his really deep, deep love of Westerns. And having seeing Westerns as a kid and growing up and becoming obsessed with what the Western genre really was, the spark for him to develop a deep love of film and then eventually become a filmmaker. And I really feel like when you watch Vampires, you see that love, that passion for westerns combined with horror. And I'm a big fan of when a film can take, you know, two different genres or multiple genres and blend them together seamlessly. And in some ways, and I think in this context with vampires, to kind of to take the vampire, story or mythology that, we're kind of accustomed to with a lot of those tropes, and really does something different with it, with that whole kind of world, the genre film of, you know, films about vampires, films about Dracula, and the whole kind of lore around it, and the whole mythology that we're accustomed to seeing. And this takes that kind of style or that genre, the vampire genre, and I think does something different, and then also puts it in a really unique setting by making it essentially just kind of a badass western that happens to be a vampire movie. And it really is. I think it's really big time western vibes throughout the entire film. The tone of it, the action in the film, the set pieces, even especially the music that John Carpenter composed for the film. That's a big, big thing in the movie. So, and the cast is really great. I love the story. This is actually Vampires was actually adapted from a book, but it's great. It's a really kind of a unique vampire film, and I'm a huge genre fan of, I'm a huge fan of vampire movies in general and the vampire genre, but I'm also a massive fan of westerns, and this is like a great combination of all those things. It really is. Another film that I could think of that takes those two things, really puts them together really, really well, in a awesome, like, stylistic way of, blending different genres, From Dusk Till Dawn. That's a masterpiece, and I feel like that has that too. But I feel like Vampires is one of those movies when you think about John Carpenter. I mean, most people obviously talk about Halloween, and all rightfully so, and The Thing, and They Live, In the Mouth of Madness, Christine. I mean, so many great films. Assault on Precinct 13. Just so many. Escape from New York. I mean, god damn, so many great movies. But I feel like Vampires is, in a lot of ways, just as good as a lot as those movies. But it doesn't get the. I feel like across the board, this movie does not get the credit it deserves. And I think you know it's. I mean, it's John Carpenter making a vampire movie, so it's like, how can you not? How could you not be excited by that? And James Woods is so great in this film. It's got such a great cast. I mean, from top to bottom, kind of a stacked cast for vampires. James Woods, of course. Cheryl Lee's in this movie. She's so awesome in it from Twin Peaks. Thomas Ian Griffith plays Valak, the lead vampire, who is super awesome. I'm a huge fan of Valak in this movie. I think he is like I think his role as Thomas Ian Griffith's portrayal of Valak is super badass. I think he is um, just a really great designed vampire, and he's kind of this ultimate, almost at the level of more or less a Dracula. He plays this kind of supremely powerful vampire who's been around for hundreds of years, and he's kind of badass in this movie. Thomas Ian Griffith was an actor who he's been in tons of movies. He was in the Karate Kid films. That's where I know him from, and he was he's been a martial artist for many years, but he is so great in as Valak in Vampires. It's really great. Great again across the board. The cast is pretty fantastic. It's got great kills, really great atmosphere. The cinematography is pretty breathtaking. It was all shot in New Mexico. So it really by them shooting this film in New Mexico, it really gives the film that classic Western aesthetic. Like the cinematography in this film is breathtaking. Dean Cundy did not do the cinematography for this film, which I was a little bit surprised. He's my favorite cinematographer, and he didn't do the work for this film, but it still looks amazing. So yeah, just tremendous. So I definitely, I can't recommend Vampires enough. It's one of those movies that, one of those situations. Sometimes you see a movie, it happens sometimes with music for me. Same kind of thing where you see something or hear something at a particular, time in your life, and maybe for whatever reason it doesn't quite connect, but then you revisit it, in a different maybe headspace or later in life, and you're like, holy shit, this is awesome. It totally connects, and vice versa. I've had that experience of something you really like, and then you watch it later or you experience it later, and you're like, oh man, like I almost think of it. You could have those moments of like, what the fuck was I thinking, that kind of moment, but it can be on two different sides of the spectrum, or the side of the story where you're like, wow, that was really good. What the fuck was I thinking? Why didn't I get into that movie? Or why couldn't I get into this band at the time? Or again, vice versa, where you're like, what the fuck was I thinking? Because this is not very good, and it doesn't stand the test of time or whatever. So it's pretty funny. It's pretty funny how that happens. And there's been examples of that happening, with music, and I've had that happen to me a few times with movies as well. In this case, definitely with a movie. But I can't recommend this beautiful edition of this movie, and I feel like people should definitely talk about this movie more because it's really good and you know great, a really great example of kind of perfectly combining two genres. The vampire genre and the western genre. Like a perfect marriage. So yeah, thanks again. We'll see you next time. Peace.